Hello, America. Judge Andrew Napolitano here in for Glenn tonight. The budget battle is over. Or is it? Last Friday at the 11th hour, lawmakers reached an agreement over the rest of the 2011 fiscal year budget. They cut $38 billion in spending from what the president wanted. That's a bit more than 1% of the whole budget. It's downright embarrassing to see lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, well, excluding the few that demanded much bigger cuts, go to the mat over just peanuts. This budget negotiation was just another example of politicians acting like children. $38 billion is such a small number. Whether you believe in unconstitutional big government that can right any wrong or regulate any behavior, or constitutional abiding small government that should leave people alone, these cuts should mean nothing. The federal government, even after the cuts, will still need to borrow $1 trillion between now and this October. And yet, many on the left, like Princeton economics professor and New York Times columnist Paul Krugman, are furious at the president for allowing these cuts because, Professor Krugman says, many on the right are championing the cuts as a principled stand against big government. What nonsense. But there is a glimmer of hope. The final vote on the budget deal has not yet happened. Last Friday's agreement only funds the government through this Thursday. Congress still needs to vote on this budget deal. Here we go again. Joining me now is a major voice of the Tea Party, Kentucky Republican Senator Rand Paul. Senator Paul, welcome here. What's the feeling? Good to be with you. Thank you. What's the feeling amongst Tea Party members in Congress? Did the White House cave or did the Republican leadership cave?
Well, the amazing thing about it is for all the talk of cutting government and cutting government spending, we will spend more in 2011 than we spent in 2010. The deficit in 2011, this year, will be next year. So we're we were going to, and yet the deficit grows larger and spending larger.
All right, Senator Paul, we're having a little difficulty hearing you, and we hope to get through to you. Soon. What Senator Paul was arguing before we had our technical difficulties. I think he's back with us now. Senator Paul, are you back with us?
Yes, I am. What I was saying is basically this.
All right, we're having some difficulty with him, but the argument he was making is that the government will be spending more money this year than it did last year, even with the cuts. All right, the next big budget battle facing Capitol Hill is over the need to raise the $14.3 trillion debt limit. And Republicans like House Speaker John Boehner are saying no way to an increase. Over the weekend at a fundraiser, Speaker Boehner said this: the president says, I want you to send me a clean bill. Well, guess what, Mr. President? Not a chance you're going to get a clean bill. And I can tell you this, there will not be an increase in the debt limit without something really, really big attached to us. Joining me now, Republican Congressman Connie Mack of Florida. Congressman Mack, it's a pleasure. Welcome to the Glenn Beck program.
Thank you, Judge. It's good to be with you, and you look good at this time of the day.
Oh, you're very kind. Thank you. We were just talking to Senator Rand Paul, your Republican colleague, before we had some technical difficulties, and we hope to bring him back, about who caved in this deal. Charlie Rangel's seated next to me, and he has his own views, and we'll get to them in a few minutes. But in Congressman Connie Mack's view, who caved? The Republican leadership in the Congress or the White House?
Well, you know, I don't want to start saying who caved. But what I would like to point out is that the little amount of cuts that we got in spending, you would have thought, the left, you would have thought that we were defunding all of government. I mean, we're talking such a small percentage, a small number in actual cuts. I mean, I think this last deal is going to be about $26 billion out of almost a $3.5 trillion budget. Right. I mean, it's amazing that we can't even come together to make real cuts because we are broke.
Well, here's the point that Senator Paul was making, and I will make with Congressman Rangel, and I'll put it to you. After all of this haggling and going down almost literally to the last minute on Friday night, the President, Speaker Boehner, Majority Leader Reid agreed to a budget for the rest of this fiscal year, which is just the next 6 months, that spends $38 billion less than what the President wanted to spend. it still authorizes the president to borrow $1 trillion. So by October, you know this, Congressman Mack, the $14.3 trillion debt will be $15.3 trillion debt. That cannot be considered progress for those of us like you and me and many people watching now who believe that just like your household and mine, the government should live within its limits. It shouldn't spend more than it takes in. So how can this be a victory for anybody except the big government people who think we can just keep piling debt onto debt onto debt?
Well, I agree with you, Judge. I don't look at this as a victory. The sad thing here is as we negotiate and battle back and forth in Washington, it's people back home who are hurting. And they're the ones that recognize that we cannot continue to sustain this spending. And I think they're quite offended that the amount of cuts we got is so little compared to the overall budget that we spend here in Washington, D.C. Frankly, a lot of that money is spent on things that most people back home don't know about and don't care about.
If members of Congress vote for this deal, doesn't that mean that they are not concerned about this bottomless pit of debt? They are willing to make the bottomless pit deeper. They just don't take the issue of debt seriously.
Well, I'll let all the other members speak for themselves, but for me, I take this seriously, Judge. We cannot continue to spend like we are. It's why I voted no on the CR on Friday, and it's why I'm going to vote no coming up later this week on the CR, because this is a drop in the bucket. And if we're going to be serious about cutting the debt, cutting the deficit, balancing the budget, something like $26 billion, which is what the new cut is going to be come Friday, is nothing. And it should be appalling to a lot of people that we couldn't find a way to cut more money out of the budget.
All right. In about 2 or 3 weeks, the government will reach its borrowing limit. It'll reach literally that 14.3. It's about actually 14.294 trillion. And then the president will come to the Congress and say, give us authority to borrow more. This is, as you know, called raising the debt ceiling, letting the government dig that $14.3 trillion hole even deeper. How will Congressman Connie Mack vote on that? Yes, Mr. President, go borrow another $1.6 trillion. No, Mr. President, you can't borrow any more money. Operate the government on the money that the IRS collects for you.
As I've told you before, Judge, and I'll say it over and over again, why have a debt ceiling if all you're going to do when you approach it is raise it? The reason we have a debt ceiling in the first place is so a long time ago we could have started looking at ways to cut spending so we wouldn't have to even have a conversation about raising it. Unfortunately, the Congress is now in a position, we're going to hear it from both sides, that we don't have enough time to do anything else, that we have to raise the debt limit ceiling. I'm going to vote no on raising the debt limit ceiling. I don't think it's the right thing for it to do, and I think the people back home, again, Judge, the people back home are saying, look, I have to live within our means at home, and the federal government has to live within its means. And by the way, its means is the people's money, not ours.
Right. Congressman Connie Mack of Florida, thanks very much for joining us. Senator Rand Paul, Republican of Kentucky, rejoins us on the telephone. Sorry about the technical difficulties, Senator Paul, but we're happy, and those watching us now are happy that you're here. You were explaining to us, I think, when we had these technical difficulties, that notwithstanding the $38 billion in cuts that the White House says are too big, that the Republican leadership says are not big enough, that the Tea Party persons in the Congress say are not nearly big enough, the government will actually spend more in 2011 than it did in 2010.
Yeah, this is what's amazing to me. For all the discussion with people saying, oh, we're going to cut spending, it's great that we're going to cut spending, we will spend more this year than we did last year. The deficit will also be more this year than it was last year. The interesting thing is, during the 8 days that we debated this last spending bill, we borrowed over $50 billion in those 8 days, and then they were talking about cuts of $38 billion. So we're borrowing more in 1 week than they talked about cutting. Really, they haven't yet become serious about this, and until we become serious about this, I worry about trillion-dollar annual deficit.
Right. Senator Paul, how did we get here? How did we get to this position in American history where the government borrows as much as it takes in tax revenue and seems to think that the borrowing can go on without end and without being paid back?
It's been going on for a couple of generations now, but it's accelerated. I was one of those who ran for office saying Republicans were spending way too much money during the last administration. we had $500 billion deficit. But then in 2008, when we got President Obama, it went up exponentially. So we now have $1.5 trillion deficits in 1 year. But most of the plans are arguing for gradual reduction in spending over 10 and 20 years, when in fact the increase in spending went up in a 2-year period.
Wow. When you have to vote in the next couple of weeks on raising the debt ceiling, I assume you'll be in the same column as your colleague Congressman Connie Mack, who was just on with us a few minutes ago, and you'll vote no.
Yeah, I can't vote to raise the debt ceiling unless it was the last time we're ever going to do it, and that would be that we were going to balance our budget from here on out. So if we passed the balanced budget amendment and introduced my 5-year plan to balance the budget, I could consider voting to raise the debt ceiling. But we're not there yet. We're just the will of the people is ready for us to do these things, but those in Washington, those who have been elected, are not yet hearing the voice of the people.
Senator Paul, we appreciate it. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Thanks for getting on the phone with us.
No problem.
Congress has until Thursday evening at 11:59 p.m., a minute before midnight, to come up with yet another budget agreement. And my next guest says compromise has been a filthy, ugly word for freshman Republican members. Democratic Congressman Charlie Rangel of the great state of New York and from Harlem, New York is here. Congressman Rangel, welcome here.
Good to be in your courthouse.
All right. Were you happy with this deal that the Republican leadership of the House and the Democratic leadership of the Senate and the President cut for this $38 billion
Not
reduction?
at all, but I am glad that both sides realized the negative impact it would be if we had to close down our government. I think that everyone made it abundantly clear that more than saving $38 billion, we would have lost a heck of a lot more money.
All right.
But I just wish you could ask me that one question that you asked the Congressman Mack, and that is, how did we get involved in all of this? When did it happen?
This is not a Republican or a Democratic problem. This has happened under Republican presidents and Republican Congresses and Democratic presidents and Democratic Congresses.
I wouldn't put it that way, Judge. Of course, I'm in your court.
How is it that we got to $14 trillion in debt and that nobody's concerned but the Tea Party people about paying it back?
Because if you remember, the last Democratic president that we've had, that is before Bush and Reagan, was Bill Clinton.
Right.
He left a $5.6 trillion surplus. Now, the $14 trillion didn't happen overnight.
No, I know
but
that.
several things happened.
We fought a couple of wars. We had 9/11.
Don't say
we
it
all
that
know
way,
about that.
because
I'm not
these
justifying what George Bush did. I'm asking
Well, you said, how did we get there?
You're a longtime member of Congress.
Yes.
You always vote in favor of more borrowing.
Don't say that.
It's true. How are we going to pay the money back?
First of all this business about not voting for the debt ceiling is ridiculous. Why? Because the $14.2 or $3 trillion that we owe happened before we owed it, and we still now owe the interest on what has been borrowed, whether it's Republican or Democrat.
We are paying interest on money that was spent by prior Congresses and presidents.
And if we don't pay the interest on it, if we don't raise the debt ceiling, the whole darn fiscal system collapses.
All right, you reject the Senator Pat Toomey argument that we can pay the interest from the income tax revenue. You think we have to borrow more money in order to pay interest on money that we've already borrowed and spent, right?
Let me take it, no. But let me take it a step in assuming that you're right, because this whole thing is so inequitable and so truly unfair. When last have they talked about raising revenue in order to balance the budget? They just don't talk about it.
When last have the Democrats, and even many of the Republicans, I'm not a partisan here, you know that, talked about stopping the spending or slowing the spending in order to balance the budget?
If you weren't a judge, I would say you changing the issue. Because the last question I thought you asked was, can we raise enough revenue without increasing the debt ceiling?
You understand?
And I say that this administration says that they're going to stop the spending and not have any taxes at all.
But this administration, the President Obama's administration, wants to borrow $1 trillion in 6 months. And then they want to borrow $1.7 trillion in the next 12 months. So they want to add $2.7 trillion to the debt without paying a nickel of it back. Are you in favor of that?
Judge, if you don't pay the interest on the debt.
No one's saying not pay the interest.
Well, how you got to pay it if you don't have the money?
I'm
We don't have
suggesting
the
we
money.
shouldn't be borrowing more money. We should spend less and pay off the debt. You don't want to do that.
Where are you going to get the money from if you don't borrow it? You tell me.
Well, let's see.
We're not going to raise taxes. We're not going to stop these wars.
We should stop the wars. On
That's
that, we
right.
both agree.
Well, I hope
we
so.
should stop all 5 of the wars. But we do collect about $250 billion in taxes every month. Unfortunately, we also borrow $200 billion.
We have corporations that don't play zip. We have the
that
trillionaires that don't pay
That would
zip.
be General Electric, the chairman of which is the president's good friend and sits on his advisory board.
And he's not the only one that don't pay.
Look, nobody should pay more taxes than they owe. We know that.
Republicans are saying that you don't raise taxes and you just cut spending.
And the Democrats are saying just keep borrowing ourselves into oblivion.
That's just not so. But I tell you one thing, if we do have to cut, the immoral way in which they're cutting, the poor, the sick, the aged, is not the American way to do it.
Can I tell you, even when I disagree with you, I enjoy when you come on any show with me. Charlie Rangel, thanks for joining us. Congress may have reached a budget deal, but the mother of all budget battles is yet to come. Should we raise the federal debt limit? You know where I stand on that. But a fair and balanced debate is next. To you, Charlie Rangel. Raise the debt ceiling will be the next big showdown in Washington. Republicans are threatening not to vote for an increase unless long-term spending cuts are also introduced. Here's what Democratic New York Senator Chuck Schumer had to say about that.
Playing the same game they played on shutting the government down up till the last minute and using that as sort of leverage to get things they wanted. Unfortunately, we didn't go along with a lot of them. But doing that on the debt ceiling, a disaster. A formula of playing with fire that could actually have the credit markets stop taking U.S. debt and create a recession. This should be taken off the table now.
Should it be taken off the table? Here to discuss, Art Laffer, former economic advisor to President Ronald Reagan, and Steve Moore, senior economic writer for the Wall Street Journal. Art, to you first. Your very name, the Laffer curve, stands for fiscal responsibility and stands for lower taxes and not spending more than you take in. But you agree with Chuck Schumer and with Charlie Rangel. We should raise that debt ceiling and go out and borrow money to pay our old debts, don't you?
Oh, my goodness. Oh, my goodness. Oh, my goodness. You know, the thing is, the hypocrisy of the other side is amazing. You know, President Obama, when he was a senator, voted against raising the debt ceiling.
Right.
And you know that Harry Reid, when he was a senator, if you just quote their quotes, they're exactly what the Tea Party is saying today. Now, I personally believe we should use the debt ceiling to get as much as we can from them. But no, this is not the time to have the Armageddon battle. Judge, we are going to take the Senate after the next election. We'll increase our lead in the House. At that time, we should make the big Armageddon battle and bringing it down with a Republican president, a Republican Senate, and a Republican House.
All right.
Why we fight the battle today when really we have a chance of losing politically as a result doesn't make sense to me. That's just me.
Steve Moore, would you rebut, reject, and bury forever this argument that we can't pay our debts on the basis of the revenue that the government collects alone without having to borrow $1 trillion here and $1 trillion there?
Get him, Steve. Get him.
I love what you've been saying, Judge. And, you know, just the hour that you're going to be on the air today, Judge, the federal government's going to borrow another $100 million. So these debts are racking up so quickly. I think Republicans do have to hold out for the kind of Armageddon budget changes. I think they need to get automatic spending cuts. I think they should get rid of the way we do the budget that's led to these $14 trillion of deficits. You know, we have something called current service budgeting. Arthur knows all about that.
Right.
Arthur, as you know, we build in these automatic accelerators in the budget every year. And I think we ought to have a path to a balanced budget over the next 10 years. If they don't reach those deficit and spending reduction targets, Judge, I think they should be an automatic hatchet that drops on the spending.
All right, but Art, I don't think this automatic hatchet thing would work. Do we really want federal judges, because that's who would do it, saying to the president, well, now you got to stop spending because you don't have this authority?
How else are they going to do it
by stopping the borrowing and preventing the government from borrowing and forcing it to live within its means like the three of us do, Art Laffer?
Well, I don't know about you guys, but I have a little problem every now and then. No, just teasing, Judge. Yeah, I think Steve's completely correct. But I think we need to make sure we don't lose the 2012 election. I mean, 2010 was the preamble. and the end game is 2012. You know, what we're talking about with the debt ceiling here is only something that could inure to our detriment in the coming election. And I just want to make sure we get rid of the Bushes and the Obamas from their overspending. And it's Bush in the last 2 years was terrible on this spending, and so was Obama. We can't go back to this, either party. It's not Republican or Democrat. It's not liberal or conservative.
All right.
It's not left-wing or right-wing. It's just
Arthur,
bad economics.
But Steve,
Judge,
you could take Arthur's argument and you could apply it any time, any president, whether it's a conservative Republican or a liberal Democrat like we have now, wants to raise the debt ceiling. Basically, let's just do it one more time. Let's just do it until we control Congress. Every time, every president, from Eisenhower to Obama, has asked for an increase in the debt ceiling, they've gotten it, no matter how bad the times were, no matter how fiscally conservative the Congress was. Steve Moore, what do you say about that?
I think the absolute maximum point of leverage that Republicans will have in terms of cutting the budget will come on this debt ceiling. And I think Republicans cannot blink here. They have to basically say, until we get a path to dramatic reductions in spending and dramatic reductions in debt. Look, if you've got an overspender, you do have to pay the debts you've accumulated, but you don't just keep giving a bigger spender a bigger credit allowance. As Ronald Reagan used to say, you don't give a big spender a bigger allowance. And I think that's what's at stake right here. And this is, Arthur, I think where the Republicans should draw the line in the sand with people like Chuck Schumer and Harry Reid.
Shouldn't we draw the line in the sand now, Art Laffer? We have about 30 seconds, rather than wait and hope that the Republicans take the Senate next year?
I think what I would like to see us do in this one, I'd like to see us get the tax cuts passed permanently, so we get that issue out of here. I mean, the tax increases is the worst thing you can do in a bad economy like that. Who wants to raise taxes on the last 3 people working? It's just plain stupid. But now we have to bring control of this, and I'd like to wait until we get control of the Senate. We've got 53 Democrats and independents in there versus 47 Republicans. After the next election, we're going to have 53 or 55 Republicans in there, and we'll get this stuff through easily, Steve, just what you want. And you and I agree on this, I think.
You know what? We just borrowed another $10 million in this 6 minutes.
During the course of this segment. You guys are terrific. Steve Moore, Art Laffer, thanks very much for joining us.
Great to be with you, Judge.
You got it. How the markets will react to the debt ceiling debate. More from Fox Business's Charlie Gasparino. Next. All right, Congress has until 11:59, 1 minute before midnight, this Thursday night to reach another budget compromise. So what will the markets be looking for? And what will Wall Street do if the debt ceiling is not raised? With me now on this and more, my colleague at the Fox Business Network and my good buddy Charlie Gasparino. What is Wall Street's reaction to the 11th hour compromise, the $38 billion cut, but still $1 trillion in borrowing?
Oh, I think they kind of slept through that. I mean, I think the debt ceiling is a much bigger issue, and I think what you're going to see is a lot of doomsday predictions from the street. Watch Goldman Sachs.
Right. I mean, why should we watch Goldman Sachs?
The epicenter of Wall Street progressive liberalism. Lloyd Blankfein, the CEO, Gary Cohn, the president, are two of the most progressive leftists, I guess left of center Wall Street executives we have. Huge backers of Obama.
Right.
You know, they have economists on staff that are, dyed in the wool Keynesians. If you don't spend money, they think the
Didn't President Bush's Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Paulson, come from there?
He led it about 6 years ago. It was always I wouldn't consider Hank Paulson a Adam Smith libertarian tax cutter. I mean, but he's clearly a left of center Republican.
Your argument is that some of the richest fat cats in the land love when the government borrows, they don't care about basic economics 101, and just want a piece of the action.
And look, Goldman Sachs has been putting out report after report supporting big government worrying about the Republicans cutting spending that might hurt the economy. And my prediction is within the next 24 hours, you're going to see, or maybe a little longer than that. It might take a little more to get the presses running. You're going to see Goldman Sachs put out a press release, put out some research report that we are playing with fire Armageddon if the Republicans don't cave.
All right. We are hearing today that on Wednesday, the president will ask for tax increases. So the same president who signed into law the retention of the Bush-era tax cuts now is going to ask for tax increases on the very same people for whom he enacted the tax cuts. People that make more than $250,000 a year. How does Wall Street react to that?
I think the rank and file Wall Street people will be obviously annoyed because a lot of them make $250 or more. I think that the leaders, the official message coming out of Wall Street, I think they'll say that's good, because I think they will spin this, and they're big supporters of the president, that this is good for the deficit. There's not many people inside these Wall Street firms in the economics departments that follow the Laffer curve.
Right.
They believe that if you raise taxes, that actually does raise revenue, when we all know in the long term it really doesn't.
Right. Laffer demonstrated that if you lower taxes, it increases economic activity and so increases revenue.
And if you raise taxes, it marginally lowers economic activity, which lowers revenue in the future.
All right, before we break, even though we're very good friends, I'm going to give you a chance to beat up on me. You know that I believe we shouldn't borrow another nickel, that we should not raise the debt ceiling, because I think there's a time to draw the line in the sand, and it's now. We're looking into an abyss that's going to take $14.3 trillion to fill. Tell me why I'm wrong.
Do you believe we should default?
No. Pat Toomey argues, a friend of yours and mine, now Senator Toomey, but formerly an economist, that we can pay our debt service and pay our bills on the income that is generated from income taxes.
Well, if we can,
we don't have to borrow.
Listen, I mean, this is a debate we're going to have in the next 24 hours.
Right.
If we could pay our debt service, I mean, no one wants U.S. going to default. That's big problems.
Correct.
If we could pay our debt service, let it ride. Let's play chicken.
So if we can pay our debt service, you'd agree with me, the time to stop the borrowing is now.
Right now. We have as Steve Moore said before, the Republicans have the best hand they have in a long time right now.
And your buddies on Wall Street don't want that to happen.
Who cares about them?
All right. Charlie Gasparino,
They're not
God
my
bless
buddies,
you.
first off.
All right. Thanks very much for joining us. President Obama's budget compromise not gaining much applause from the left. Some liberals are publicly lashing out at the president as, quote, standing for nothing. Is he losing his base? That debate is right here next.
Business in America. This is Fox Business. Varney and Company.
Has anyone seen President Obama lately? Apparently members of his own party are looking for him. New York Times opinion columnist Paul Krugman writes, quote, the president is missing and has been so since 2008 when voters first elected him. He accuses President Obama, along with some others on the left, of not standing for anything and caving to the GOP. And the poll numbers confirm that Professor Krugman is not alone. A new Rasmussen poll says just 37% of liberals strongly approve of the president's performance. That's down from 63% a year ago. Here now to debate that are Kirsten Powers, a New York Post columnist and Fox News contributor, and my good friend and Tea Party Nation founder, Judson Phillips. Judson, to you first, from the Tea Party's point of view, and you know, and Kirsten knows, and the folks watching us know, that I am one of you. Did the president cave, or did Speaker Boehner cave with this $38 billion cut in the 11th hour on Friday night?
John Boehner's freshly laundered white flag of surrender flutters above the Potomac even as we speak today. Obama came away from that as a big winner. I mean, that guy has clearly been taking poker lessons from Harry Reid. They played a bad hand, and they played it to the hilt, and there's no question Boehner and the GOP got their heads handed to them.
All right, Kirsten, if Speaker Boehner and the GOP had their heads handed to them, then what is Paul Krugman and what is Robert Reich and what are other prominent members of the left complaining about today?
Well, I don't think that Boehner had his head handed to him at all, actually. He took the Democrats from wanting zero cuts to up to $40 billion. I mean, that was more than what the Republicans' original request was. So I would say that Boehner actually played the Democrats pretty well. But what Paul Krugman is complaining about, and what a lot of Democrats are complaining about, is more about the overall argument, which is that liberals believe, and Obama even had been arguing himself, that we need to be stimulating the economy, not making cuts. And he not only did he give in on the number, but he gave in on the argument. You know, he basically ceded to the Republicans by coming out and saying, hailing this agreement and saying, oh, how great is this? We did all these cuts. And he was agreeing with the Republican narrative.
Got it. Judson, I know you're on the other side of the aisle, so maybe you speak with purity on this, but is the President of the United States in danger of losing his political base? Are Paul Krugman and Robert Reich and folks who agree with them 37% of liberals now approve. That's the lowest he's ever had amongst that group. Is that a threat to Barack Obama's reelection?
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, there's another poll I saw today, and I wish I could correctly attribute it. Something like 19% of Americans overall strongly support Obama. So he's got a huge problem here. you know, Obama's been hit with the terrible torpedo of truth, and that is Americans don't like socialism. And that's sort of his default position. But every time he tries to go to that, he realizes, for once, Americans are now seriously worried about the debt crisis. We're looking at $5 a gallon gas. We're upset. The liberals alone are not going to get Barack Obama reelected, and he's losing that base. He's losing the American, the rest of the American people. He's looking at unemployment in 2013.
Right. All right, Kirsten, put aside that we don't know, obviously, who the Republican nominee will be, and no one could know this. But from your point of view in the Democratic Party, as someone who worked in the Clinton administration and has been keenly observing these things for years, is the president in trouble? Did you ever think that a president as liberal as this would be perceived by the left as too centrist or too close to the right?
Well, I just first want to address the socialism comment. You know, if Obama's a socialist, I'm the Queen of England. I mean, it's so ridiculous. I'm so tired of hearing it. He is so far from socialist, which is why the liberals don't like him.
But he does believe in central Kirsten, in central economic planning, whether you want to call that socialism or something else.
Fine. I mean, but he's not a, I mean, he's so far removed from that. It's just so absurd. But
is he in trouble with his base?
No, he's in trouble with his base, but this is why I don't think he's in trouble overall.
Go ahead.
Because A, he has no worthy opponent. B, if you look at the polling on this budget deal, Democrats overwhelmingly supported it. 2/3 of Democrats approved of this deal. So while liberals may be complaining, they're a very small part of the party. And more importantly, independents overwhelmingly approved of this deal.
Got it. Got it.
That's what Obama was going for.
Got it. Judson, we got about 30 seconds left. How divided are the Republicans? Are the Tea Party folks that you lead going to challenge John Boehner and Eric Cantor and Kevin McCarthy and the leadership of the Republican Party in primaries next year?
Yeah, well, if I have anything to say about it, I know Boehner's going to have a challenger. I certainly hope a lot of these guys do, because they're not paying attention. This is one thing where we are unified. We're saying stop the spending, no more debt. We're united on this, and Boehner and some of them better listen.
Got it. Judson Phillips, Kirsten Powers, it's a pleasure. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. The Egyptian army, once the guardian of the revolution, now turning on crowds of peaceful protesters in Tahrir Square. Why the about face and why the killings? Details next. Millions of Egyptians banded together to bring about revolution. But is the military now trampling over their chance at democracy? A young blogger was just sentenced to 3 years in prison for speaking out against the government, while a deadly assault was launched against pro-democracy protesters this weekend. Joining me now, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, author of A Warrior's Rage and a former lifetime career military person himself. Colonel, are you surprised that the military in Egypt, which was once considered the liberator of the folks in the street from the despot Hosni Mubarak, is now turning on them?
Well, the short answer, Judge, is absolutely not. The Egyptian army was never the guardian of the revolution. The Egyptian army exists to preserve order in Egypt. They're not going to allow chaos to ensue, and chaos is exactly what will happen if the Egyptian army surrenders control of that country to the various elements who want to overthrow Mubarak's regime, which incidentally is still in power.
All right, let me get this straight, that there are elements in the streets that overthrew Mubarak and the military allowed that to happen, but some of the elements in the streets that want to take over the government are worse than Mubarak, and the military knows that.
Well, of course. Listen, this is true from Morocco to the Red Sea. There will be no liberal democracy in the Arab world. Let's get that straight. The conditions for it don't exist. The culture doesn't support it. There's no rule of law, no respect for private property. Graft, corruption are rampant. These regimes survive on the basis of two things: their ability to pass out cash and benefits to supporters, and their ability to suppress dissent.
Colonel,
that's not going to change.
Colonel, does the President of the United States understand what you just said? And if so, why has he chosen sides in the Libyan civil war?
Well, I think, Judge, we've been down this road before. You know, Libya is not very different from Egypt. In fact, the standard of living in Libya is much higher, and Gaddafi has actually done a better job of improving living standards for his people than was done in Egypt. But the truth is, the president doesn't care. He's an ideologue. He thinks that we can export liberal democracy at gunpoint. We can create instant republics on the Western model anywhere we want. It has never worked. We've been failing at this for decades, and we continue to waste trillions of dollars in American blood on it.
president is now suggesting that refugees from Libya could fly in military planes to the United States and land at McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey as part of his so-called humanitarian effort to save people. What kind of a national security issue is this going to create?
Well, look, the last thing that we need right now in the United States is to add to the growing underclass and the numbers of people who are already dependent on federal subsidies and government. And that's exactly what would happen. We need to reduce those numbers.
What will it take for us to get out of the Libyan mess that we're involved in?
I think if I were president, I would simply say we've been enormously successful to date and we are leaving. Get out. Disengage as quickly as possible. And it's costing over $100 million a day. We need to get out of Afghanistan and Iraq, too.
All right. Colonel Macgregor, it's always a pleasure. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Judge.
This Friday, a very special show hosted by Glenn in defense of Israel. Set your DVRs now, Friday at 8 p.m. My closing thoughts, next. Does the government work for us or do we work for the government? What good is a budget deal to cut $38 billion from the president's proposals if it will only put us all deeper into debt? Tonight, the budget, the nature of government, and you. Last week, Washington averted a government shutdown with a midnight deal to spend $38 billion less than the president originally wanted to spend in the next 6 months. This was done the last minute because the Democrats failed to produce a budget for 2011 when they controlled both houses of Congress in 2010. This budget deal came about by the president's view that economic problems generated by too much borrowing and spending can be solved by more borrowing and spending, and the Republican establishment's fear that if they don't redistribute wealth, they might be voted out of office. To paraphrase Macbeth, this is a tale told by idiots, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Does anyone around Washington understand basic economics? Can anyone in Washington tell the truth? The truth is the president will need to borrow another $1 trillion in order to spend what both parties have just agreed to let him spend. So calling the $38 billion reduction off of $1 trillion in red ink a victory for fiscal conservatism or for small government just doesn't make any sense. It is a cut from what the president wanted to spend. It still enables him to spend $1 trillion more than the government receives in revenue. That's where basic economics comes in. America, you may be tired of hearing this, but your government owes $14.3 trillion because president's now dead and Congress is now long out of office, borrowed against the future, and those bills are now due. They are now due because with economic times difficult, the tax base is shrinking, and taxpayers can only afford so much in taxes before the government ruins them, and the government can only afford so much in payments in interest on the debt before we all become enslaved to those from whom the dead presidents and the out-of-office Congresses have borrowed all this money. If most Republicans agree with what I just said, and they claim that they do, how can they possibly agree that we can now borrow another $1 trillion in just the next 6 months? If we haven't the money or the means to pay back so much as $1 of the $14.3 trillion we owe, how can we morally borrow another $1 trillion? There was a time when the two political parties stood for different values, but their thirst for power and their enjoyment in exercising it, what St. Augustine called the lust to dominate, has brought these two parties into a collaborative arrangement whereby they pretend to do battle over values. In reality, they accept the same principles, such as the need for war, the desirability of central economic planning, the indispensability of debt, and the wisdom of transferring wealth in order to buy votes. This is indeed a sad state of affairs that leadership in both parties accept these views so antithetical to those of the framers, views so socialistic in nature, views so violative of your natural right to do as you wish with your earnings and your property, views so utterly calculated to deliver us to economic doom as to be called un-American at their core and to constitute a government based in legalized theft. What shall we do? We should encourage every Republican in Congress and the few Democrats who will listen to vote against the president's proposals to allow him to borrow the $1 trillion this year and the $1.7 trillion he wants to borrow next year. Those votes have yet to be taken, and there is still a chance the borrowing could stop. And we should force the government, just like we do at home, to live within its means. And if it doesn't, then we should in due time replace it with a government that means what it says when it swears fidelity to the Constitution. Because the majority of these folks in power now don't. From New York, defending freedom. So long, America.